name is Olivia Altamirano. I am a clinical psychologist working at Stanford and particularly in the Inspire Clinic, which is an early psychosis clinic. I'm here this weekend to present on a symposium on a destigmatizing psychosis class that myself and my colleague Priya Chari are teaching at the University of Stanford for Stanford undergraduates. So I knew for a long time that I wanted to go into the field of psychology. I went to community college for a couple of years after high school. There were just some financial barriers such that I didn't go straight to a four-year. At JC, I got a scholarship to go to the University of California, Santa Cruz. And there, it was in my abnormal psychology class that I met Dr. Tony Huffman. And one of the things that he mentioned that really stuck with me was that there was a really high need to strengthen the workforce, because a lot of people, even within our field of psychology and psychiatry, didn't want to work with this population. And so I thought, then what happens if there's just no one to work with this population? Then where will they receive care? And so it was then that I decided I would apply for an internship at a local subacute facility. And unfortunately, at the time that I applied, I was informed that they were no longer working with university students, because in the recent months kind of leading up to my application, they'd had a lot of people join and stay a day, a week, and then leave because it was something that they weren't able to kind of navigate. And so that was not an option. Luckily, for me at least, a few months later, they were looking for staff to work there. So I applied as staff, and that was my first experience working with people with psychosis, was, knocking on doors, reminding people of dinner time, encouraging people to get out of their rooms. We would go play basketball or go hang out and chat. It was a really meaningful experience for me. And then that was where I found my second niche, which was the Spanish-speaking population. So in this program, people had to go to the center's programming, like groups, for instance, to move up their levels to eventually be discharged from this facility. And throughout my 2 years there were a handful of monolingual Spanish speakers who also had to do the same. And I thought, well, they can go to these groups, and how much they're able to process is basically absent, right? There's none, because these are all held in English. And so, I was a bachelor's level at that point, and I had a wonderful mentor, Anna, who worked there, and she had the faith in me, gave me this treatment manual, and it was the kind of thing where something was better than nothing, I think. And so I had my little group with 2 people, and we just, talked in Spanish and went through the manual in Spanish. And eventually I applied to grad school with a very particular focus in working with the Spanish-speaking populations with psychosis, and that's what I do today. Not everyone's going to relate to this, and that's totally okay, but I see it as a responsibility. My first language was Spanish. My parents are immigrants, and so the way I see it is there are very few of us in this field that have this particular combination of expertise that I have. And for myself, it certainly continues to be a driver. And at the same time, there are a lot more people that can do cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis in English. There are very few of us that can do that in Spanish. And so, again, I think for me, I see it certainly as a motivator, and also a responsibility that I have. I just had a friend recently, means well, but I hadn't seen her in a couple of years, and she asked me something along the lines of so are you working with normal people now, or something like that. It was one of those things with what do you mean? Define normal for me. And again, really well-meaning person, but I think that one of the biggest stigmas out there is that people with psychosis are not normal, right? And I don't have lived experience, and I don't want to speak for people that do, but I think that psychosis exists on a spectrum, right? And we've all had an experience of, like, when Watches came out, I sometimes feel like it's vibrating and I look down and there's nothing, it's not vibrating, or the experience of someone calling our names. And so for most often, we're able to come to the conclusion that, oh, that wasn't what I was experiencing. We kind of move on. And for people with psychosis, maybe they're just having that experience more often and it's harder to do the moving on piece, right? But I think one of the biggest stigmas out there is that people are not able to live meaningful lives, or that their experience is wildly different from ours. And again, from my perspective, psychosis exists on a spectrum, and we can all experience these things that might sometimes be a loss of touch with reality, and we can all still live very meaningful lives. In the last couple of years, certainly, I've started to think that a lot of this begins at a kind of prevention level, not so much with psychosis, but rather prevention of that formation of the public stigma, which is why, I'm very excited about this class that I mentioned earlier with undergraduate students. I think if we could start even earlier than that, that would be great. But by the time that someone receives a diagnosis, often they already have an understanding based on what social media tells them, for instance, of what psychosis is. And sometimes that stigma is then internalized. And I think that there, right, is a very kind of initial barrier. And then, beyond that, of course, like access to care, insurance, I did some research in Mexico for a summer after undergraduate, and challenges with transportation, with, people had to, person with psychosis and usually a loved one would have to take a day off from work, sometimes, working in the fields in Mexico, pay for public transportation to get to the hospital, pay for transportation back. And I think, to some degree, those issues are also present here, right, with people living out in rural communities. So while it can be overwhelming to think about all of the barriers out there, I think if we focus on anything, as small as it may be, can be helpful.